I want to also be clear that engagement with the criminal justice system, poverty doesn't necessarily just cause engagement with the criminal justice system. Being part of the criminal justice system can produce poverty later on because of its impact on employment and residents and so on and so forth. So I say that because I don't want people to pathologize poor people as more likely to be criminal. I mean, you know, in some extent in which there are needs that people are trying to meet, yes, but it is also the case that police tend to, and criminal justice system in general, disadvantages people who are low income regardless of their race. And of course, because people of color are disproportionately poor, that means disproportionate outcomes relative to the criminal justice system.
Eitan, are you satisfied by the level of various stakeholders and you know, folks who were involved in the collection of this data? Who's, you know, I want to get a much clearer picture of who's collecting the data, who's talking about it. Are Black Vermont communities included in that conversation? And when I talk about Black Vermont communities, advocates such as yourself, the influencers, the community leaders, folks on the ground who are being impacted going through those experiences. I'm just wondering, are they all involved in the collection and the methodology, the way this data is unpacked, and then ultimately how it's used?
Not enough. I mean, that's the simple answer. No, not enough. The panel that I chair came into existence in 2017. We are doing as much as we can, as quickly as we can, but no, that there are not enough stakeholders involved. There needs to be far more discussion. Frankly, we need to sit and think about how those discussions will look, how they will take place. Of course, that is now more complicated with the advent of the pandemic, but it is not impossible. We need to, I mean, again, some of the data that we're hoping for is simply not collected. I mean, we really do need, I mean, as Professor Seguino points out, I mean, stuff on prosecution is, some of it just doesn't even exist. And what we were trying to at least get the legislature to look at was, this has got to stop. We really have to get to a point where this is standardized, where this comes together in some way that is commensurate, that we're not comparing apples and oranges as it goes. And that is still, for me, in its early stages of discussion.
Karen, talk about the role of the Crime Research Group in addressing that problem right there, and making sure that this conversation, that collection, that the way that the data, the information is being shared and utilized can be much more holistic and much more inclusive. Is that something that you are supposed to do as a Crime Research Group, or that you have a mission to do, is to make that conversation more inclusive, to make the decision-making or the process force the government to be more inclusive and transparent around that?
I'm not sure we can force anybody to do that, but we do certainly encourage people to share their data. We build relationships with different organizations so that we understand what it takes to obtain data from them. There's a couple slides that Debbie posted for everyone to view, and there is a slide in there that talks about what's public data. We have very limited public data here in Vermont in the criminal justice system. One of the public data files is a DOC data files. You can go on vermont.data.gov, which Kristen McClure oversees, and download all the raw DOC data for people who are under their supervision right now. That's been a huge step ahead in sharing data. The other data that is also publicly available is NIBRS data, which is National Incident-Based Reporting data that the FBI collects. You can go to the FBI website and download that raw data. And you can also, traffic stop and race data has been made available by the legislature in their statute on fair and impartial policing. And that data is also public. other data in Vermont, you have to either get a data sharing agreement, other law enforcement data needs a data sharing agreement, other DOC data that looks at education. Robin mentioned this before, education and marital status and other data fields, there needs to be a data sharing agreement. Court data is done by data sharing agreement. I will say we have had answer data questions from the court data set. We have 30 years of court data. We're happy to answer any question that is a data request. And
no, I have here, Karen, I have someone, once again, it's Sissy in the Zoom group chat. She's saying that the data does exist. Every arrest is booked equals there is data, and at arrest, the person self-identifies race.
Correct.
NIBRS releases data. She's using a questionable word, crapola data. That's what she's saying. I'm quoting that is aggregated. Address that.
Sure. This is Robin. So,
Robin.
yeah, so NIBRS is just to let everyone, so we're all on the same acronyms here. It's a national incident-based reporting system. And Vermont is one of the few states that has been 100% compliant with NIBRS data since the 1990s. And what this means is we can get a very rich sense of crime in Vermont. So, for example, I've used the NIBRS data to examine what domestic violence looks like here. So what are the age and the race of the victim compared to the offender? What are the, what weapons are used? Where do these incidents take place? Wealth of information. And now the whole country is going to NIBRS they're beginning the transition now. There are very much limitations to the data. The FBI makes the raw data downloadable, so you can get incident level data. It is not pretty. You have to know what you're doing to work with it, and I trust that Ms. Bradford actually does know. I've seen her work. The average citizen won't be able to do that. They do have visuals that you can interact with on the FBI website, so you can see, for example, the race of people who were arrested for various crimes. But the raw data are there. There are definitely limitations. So, for example, we don't have what are called Vermont-specific fields for NIBRS. So if you want the town, so if you take Vermont State Police, for example, and they patrol lots of areas, if you wanted to know the town that an arrest for VSP happens from the NIBRS data, you would have to take the incident number and then backtrack that into their system to actually just get the town, because the town of the incident is not actually a NIBRS field. Huge oversight on the part of the FBI, but it's, that's there. So there are ways to do it. The NIBRS does not collect every crime. It collects quite a lot, and I think we included in our slides the types of crimes that it does, and if not, I can certainly get those out to people. And for other crimes that aren't NIBRS offenses, yes, you have to extract that from the CAD RMS systems, the record systems that the individual police officers keep. In some ways, we are lucky here in Vermont. Right now, we only have 2.5 CAD RMS systems. Other jurisdictions, every police department has a different one. Currently, the Commissioner of Public Safety is negotiating a contract, so we will just have one CAD RMS system in the state, and we'll be able to extract that data easily. So for NIBRS offenses, it's all out there in the public. Some of it is visualized, and you can play around with the visualizations. Some of it is all numbers, and you have to know what you're doing to combine all the files. Happy to help anyone to do that.
Got it. Kristen, jump in here, and then I'll go to Pat, and then I know, Susanna, you have to leave at about 11. But Kristen, as you're listening to all of this and you're hearing issues, challenges with respect to availability of data, also the transparency, and just sort of reflect on that, address that, like how are you tackling that transparency problem, but also ensuring that this data, this troubling data, flows to the policymakers, not just folks within Vermont state government, but also the legislators, state legislators, and also local legislators, so they can address all these various problems, and whether it's on the state level or whether it's in their respective jurisdiction.
Yeah, so I want to kind of break it down and really focus on what's really going on, kind of like ground this in reality of the systems, the data, kind of facts and oriented. So Joy was right on when she said we're migrating the public safety department for the state police, migrating to one system. And that's really important and really critical. And the benefit of that is you have one consolidated system where the data is entered in a consistent manner. And then you can more easily, readily make that available and share it, because you don't have to do as much translation and data cleaning across different systems. So having consolidated systems with the data is really important. And we see that in corrections where we, again, have one system. So again, consolidated, standardized collection around that. The challenge, and this is a challenge not just for Vermont or for government, but for big industries too, it's sharing that data and communicating that data across disparate systems. So we're talking about, we have the police system, we have the court system, we have corrections. Even if we have one consolidated system within each one, it's still different across. So sharing that's, when I say sharing, I mean communicating that data across is technically a challenge. And there's certainly things we can work on to make that happen. Some like big picture items, having a data dictionary, having an MPI, having data sharing agreements. Those are all building blocks to make that happen, that we can actually go do and have a really positive effect. So I want to put that out there. Those are concrete action items that can be done that will help advance this conversation.
Pat, follow up on that, what Kristen was saying, and the kind of data that would be more useful in informing the policymakers, the legislators, the folks who can come up with proposals, craft, actually create laws, to help form policy around this problem and reducing these disparities finally.
Yeah, so that's an important point, and I will comment that having the data only available in a raw format is not very useful to anyone except the data geeks like me. So and it is essential that a reasoned analysis happens, and it's able to summarize and visualize in a way that's immediately useful to legislators and other influencers and stakeholders. I wanted to make another comment though about NIBRS and the traffic stop data, which is what I'm most familiar with, and that is about transparency and getting back to the source. So as someone who wants to analyze the data and socialize it, advertise it, we want to get as close to the source system as possible. And traffic stop data is particular in the process of getting the data out to the public. A lot of the data that's present in 90% of, none of the fields that are present in 90% of the data are stripped out. So for example, we don't get date and time information for our traffic stops, which is, in many cases, we just are told what year the traffic stop happened, not time of year, not date of the year, not time of day. And there's so many, all that is so important. That's just one example.
And that's about to change. Just to be clear, and we heard that the legislation did not require date and time of the stop, so that's why police weren't giving it. We did negotiate with the two governance boards of the police data, VIBRS board and Valcor board. Beginning this year, there's going to be a wealth of more information that will be relevant, and more importantly, I think that will help tell the stories of people of color and their experiences with traffic stops. So for example, one of the things that we heard when we were talking to people is, I can't leave my house without getting pulled over. I get pulled over multiple times. The data as collected didn't tell those stories. Now the data fields that we're going to have can help tell those stories. So you'll be able to see the year, make, and model of the vehicle of the car, the state of the plate, the state of the and residence of the driver. And I just did this analysis for a town, and sure enough, lots of people were pulled over several times in a month. And we can all understand how awful that feels. So the police department there is going to come up with a policy, which is to run a report every month. We don't want to keep pulling out people over for the same broken taillight or because they've got DLS or something. Run a report, get it out to your people that, we've stopped this person for the broken taillight. We don't need to keep doing it. And so that kind of policy change that can happen by just honestly listening to the people. You didn't have to have all this data to prove their stories. We just needed to listen. And then that policy change can happen.
Yeah.
Can I just add something here, Charles?
Yeah, go ahead, Karen.
I just wanted to add that the statute on traffic stop and race data calls for the data to be in an analyzable format, which was really interesting to us at CRG as we're getting the traffic stop and race data submitted to us, and we're posting it on our website. That's soon to change as well. That will be available on vermont.data.gov and at the Justice Training Council's website. And we were getting criticized for having Excel spreadsheets, which is an analyzable format. And what I realized actually quite recently is that, like Pat just said, normal people, the legislators, influencers, they don't want the raw data. They don't want the data in an Excel spreadsheet. They want to see data visualizations. They want the charts. They want the bar graphs and the line graphs, because they want to be able to actually see what's going on with the data rather than getting the raw data. That was not something that was required in the legislation. It was in an analyzable format. So the light bulb for me finally went off that, the raw data is only helpful to a certain select group of us, and really someone needs to do something. And Pat's been doing some things with that raw data, but somebody needs to do something with it so it's understandable by a larger group of people.
Yeah. Suzanne, I know you have to go, but I did want to bring in this comment, and there's a question at the end of it for you before you head off. Niall Real, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. I've been part of the effort in the city of Vermont. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Haven't been to Vermont in a long time, to push for citizen oversight of our police department. Our efforts have been empowered by academic studies and data, such as Professors Brooks and Seguino's study on driving while Black and brown in Vermont. I have to read that study, Professor. For example, we learned that Black drivers in Vermont are 3 times more likely to be pulled over than the share of the population would otherwise expect us to see. The most mismatched ratio for any community in Vermont. This is all while we spend a higher percentage of our municipal budget on law enforcement than any other community in Vermont. As you might already know from the news, the conversation has sparked political chaos in our little community, including the collapse of our city council. She's describing how the efforts face obstacles. I see many members of Vermont's legislature on this call. How can the state government support these local efforts through legislation and funding further studies? Susanna?
The state and the municipalities cannot operate on different pages with respect to these issues, right? We cannot have philosophical differences of opinion on what matters, who matters, and how we should be administering justice. If I get pulled over in Virgins or Montpelier or Burlington or where have you, if I'm in a town and I get pulled over, or I get stopped as a pedestrian, or an officer comes into my home for whatever reason or on my property, regardless of what uniform or what patch that officer is wearing, I should receive the same or similar treatment under the same or similar guidelines. And the incident should be reported in the same way, regardless of what jurisdiction or what agency is I'm interacting with, right? So there has to be very, very close support and deep support between the state and municipalities. The one thing that everybody always comes up with is, well, who's going to pay for it? Where's the money going to come from? We don't have capacity. We don't have staffing. We don't have resources. And it's not an excuse. It's not an excuse. Black bodies have been dropped in the street for centuries now in this country. We needed to do this yesterday. So it's no longer an appropriate excuse to lean on lack of resources or the fact that we're a small state or I only have a 4-officer department. Sorry, people's lives are on the line. And so I guess the core of the question is, how can the state support, or what is the state doing to support? I know that our state Department of Public Safety, I know that there are talks to centralize law enforcement a bit more around the state so that we can operate under a single set of guidelines. I'm very supportive of that. I like uniformity in that circumstance because I don't want to have a good or poor experience based on which agency it was. Second, I know that the Department of Public Safety is also trying a lot of techniques to bring local to municipal and county level law enforcement in line with some of its model practices and policies. And, you know, again, I mean, data are supposed to be guiding us, but if there's one thing that I want to leave you all with, it's a more philosophical thought, which is I care about the numbers. I'm not a mathematician, but I care about the numbers. But data are a tool. They are not a goal in themselves. And so what matters a lot more to me is the process equity behind it and the approach that we as government take. So it's not just about, do we have the numbers and who analyzed it? And well, this person has a PhD that they never let us forget about or whatever. It's about the fact that we have a perspective of whose data are they, who's entitled to it, who deserves to see what it is or know what it is, and what level of responsibility do we as a government, local, state, or federal, feel we have to the people to make sure that we're getting it right. And so getting it right includes collecting and analyzing data, but once we have numbers or a general sense of the trends, the next piece and the more difficult piece is doing something about it.
All right, that was Susanna Davis. I know you have to go. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Susanna Davis is the state of Vermont's first racial equity officer, if I'm not mistaken. And she's been joining us here on our live micro summit via Zoom. This is being presented to you by the Council of State Governments, Eastern Regional Conference, Council on Communities of Color. Once again, we are talking about by the numbers, the use of data and mitigating systemic racism in the criminal justice system. Susanna, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. I know you have to go, so we'll definitely catch up at a later point. This is also being done in partnership with the Vermont Legislature Social Equity Caucus, along with, once again, the Council of State Governments, Council on Communities of Color. I'm Charles Ellison. Please continue to throw in your comments and your questions in the Zoom group chat. I'll try to get, there's quite a few comments and some questions. We'll try to get to as many as possible over the next 15 or 20 minutes or so. We're gonna take this a little bit over the 11 o'clock hour before we wrap up in the next perhaps 20 minutes. I wanna get more insights from and responses from our panelists. Eitan, we had State Representative Sarah Kofi. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Coffee, it's just coffee. Okay, excellent. State Representative Sarah Coffey, excuse me, Representative, I apologize for that too. She's saying, just want to be sure that folks know that this session we passed Senate Bill 338, the Justice Reinvestment Part 2, which creates a working group that includes RDAP, I don't know what that stands for, and many others.
That's the committee I was referring to that I chair.
Okay, excellent, excellent. What is that again? What does RDAP stand for?
Call it, that's shorthand for the Racial Disparities Advisory Panel, which is basically
there
what
you go.
Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. And she's also saying many others, Defender General, State's Attorneys, Superior Judge, and Crime Research Group, among others, to identify existing data that explores the relationships between demographic factors and sentencing outcomes and determine whether and where current data systems and collections are insufficient for additional analysis, and what staffing or resources are needed to support more robust reporting. My question to Professor Eitan, has the group started and is there additional support needed?
Excellent question. The short answer is no, we are about to start. We were ready to start in pretty much March, and then once again, COVID hit, and though we were meeting by Zoom, other issues that were more immediate at that second came up that required our attention. We are ready to do so. S338 requires the RDAP at the beginning to open conversations with the Sentencing Commission. And that is on the books for our meeting. We meet once a month for 2 hours. That may need to be increased, which I know there are probably people from the RDAP listening to this at the moment, and they're probably going, I really wish he hadn't said that. There will be, I am certain, additional funding needed. I can think of things off the top of my head, but I would really rather listen to the rather worthy people in the on the panel who would have knowledge that I do not. But certainly we're going to need a lot of support on this. And as Susanna just pointed out, at some point we're going to have money, right? Someone is going to have to say, it's rather like having a house, isn't it? You look at the house and you go, okay, I don't have, I have holes in the roof and I have some storm windows that need to be fixed and it's winter and I need wood. You make certain decisions as a household owner about what needs to happen first. So maybe the roof needs to be fixed. So what I'm saying here with that metaphor is that there has to be that sort of decision making on the level of the body politic, that we really need to now look at what is happening with Black and brown bodies and to privilege that and say, this money needs to go here now. And so when we talk about additional funding, I would say that would be an area that we absolutely need to move into.
I'd like to add something here, Charles, if that would be okay.
Sure. Absolutely.
I agree with Eitan. There's been a lot of call for how do we train people in doing data entry, and we train people in doing data collection, and we train people in extracting the data from their systems and making sure that people who need to do the analysis have the data that I do want to clarify something about our work at CRG, and that is we applied for a federal grant to support our work. We have the opportunity through the designation as the Statistical Analysis Center to apply for a Bureau of Justice Statistics grant. And one of those Bureau of Justice Statistics grants, a federal grant, is what funded our traffic stop and race study. No state appropriation was made, and we do not have a contract with any law enforcement agency to do any traffic stop and race data analysis. I want to make sure that's really clear. We've also applied for federal funding. In fact, federal funding supported the data collection we did. We offered to do that for the state, so someone was collecting that data and publishing it for other people to see. We have done some of our own analysis, and we have also applied for other, and that grant actually was written in 2015. We've been working on it since then, and we've been improving the data collection process over the years, and we're hoping to have just 2 files for the data, one from Spillman and one from Valcor for 2019 data. We've also been criticized for the timing of the data, and I want to make sure that's really clear as well. The statute says the data has to be posted by September 1st, on or before September 1st. Law enforcement agencies reading that statute send the data to us on or about September 1st. Sometimes some agencies are later than that, but for the most part, the data is published on September 1st. That's not something we made up, that's in the legislation. And so people need to understand that as far as what's published for traffic stop and race data right now, we've gone by the statute. We've applied for grants and received funding to do the study of alternative programs to look at who they're serving and if they're primarily serving people of color, white people, which is our hypothesis, and therefore may be contributing to the disparities in the facilities, correctional facilities. We also have a study on offender characteristics, which is looking at who is incarcerated in the state of Vermont and looking at demographics and criminal histories, both in state and out of state. We're the first research organization to attempt to obtain out-of-state criminal histories from the FBI. We're in the middle of that process, and that's why this particular project is taking a long time. We applied for it in 2017, and we have a couple other projects going on as well that are looking at disparities in the criminal justice system. But there's some comments about our work, and I just wanted to be really clear. We're federally funded by grants we applied for.
Let me ask this, and I know you all, I don't profess to be a technology expert or someone who hails from the technology or IT world, but I am very familiar with a lot of the conversations and debates and controversy within that space. And one reflection, one issue that constantly comes up is the lack of inclusion in that space, the lack of Black professionals in the technology, IT, data collection space. I wonder, I want to get some insights from Kristen, Pat, Karen, even Robin. Are there, it's frequently commented on, like, for example, the technology that's developed, like the artificial intelligence these days, is primarily created by white people. And that's why we see a lot of these biases, these inherent biases in the technology that suddenly pops up. There aren't Black professionals or Black IT experts, folks coming out of that STEAM pipeline from, say, historically Black colleges and universities who are not being hired on these projects. Is Vermont looking at that very closely, like saying, hey, listen, maybe one way to solve this problem is hiring more Black people, Black staffers to, or Black technology developers, Black IT consultants, Black IT experts, who can look at this problem or unpack it from their perspective or from a different angle, and in a way that's culturally competent. I wonder about that, if that's something Vermont is doing. I know the state's only 1% Black, but are you creating that professional IT pipeline that can help with that diversity and inclusion and disparity issue? Anyone can jump in on that.
I would jump in and say, I think we can definitely do more. I don't.
Well, let me ask you, Karen, I mean, is the crime research, your group, I mean, do you have any Black IT developers or anyone Black on staff who's helping you with this project now?
Well, up until a month ago, there was only 2 of us. So we are not a big organization. It was me as the executive director and Dr. Joy as the director of research. We have recently hired, and I actually didn't get applications from people of color that.
Are you actively searching, however? Do you, because we're talking about racial disparities here, we're in this big moment and the investments have to be made. So are you actively searching? Have you had conversations with, for example, the many historically Black colleges and universities that have IT and STEAM or STEM programs that could provide that kind of expertise to you?
I sent out, no, we could do more. I have not done that. We did send out the ad far and wide. God, now I can't remember the app.
Indeed. So this is Robin. I think the tech question and hiring in tech, I'm going to throw back to Kristen. I do want to suggest one thing, though, about the bias in algorithms and what we are actively doing. So we have a grant right now from the Arnold Foundation, and the Arnold Foundation has this pretrial assessment tool that's supposed to predict behavior. And I'm testing it on Vermont data because, right, I want to know that it works for Vermonters, but the bias is baked into those, so that it's based on criminal histories. And the bias is baked into those criminal histories. So working with researchers from New York, we are going through those criminal histories and cutting out every arrest made by NYPD during the stop and frisk era, because those arrests are bad. We can't use those arrests. Likewise, we should go through and get rid of every arrest out of LAPD during their bad years, Chicago PD, et cetera, et cetera. So we are cognizant that one of the great predictors of the way the criminal justice system is going to act, which is the criminal histories, is loaded with that baked-in racism. And what do we do actively to try to correct that?
Kristen, I want to go back to that earlier question. Thank you for that too, Robin. And Kristen, I want to go back to my earlier question. I mean, what your office is doing as Chief Data Officer, are you actively creating a pipeline of Black IT consultants, Black IT experts, people from, say, historically Black colleges and universities? I mean, I think that big opportunity moment is showing itself right now in this big national moment that we're going through. And I'm wondering what your office is doing about that.
Yeah, I think it's really important to think about our STEM pipeline and what that looks like, and to make sure it's inclusive of all people and races and color. Well, to answer your question right now we're realistically focused on some of the budget economic resources that we have to work with. So we're not looking at growing right now, at least my team. But that's certainly a focus item, making
Does
sure
your
our
team have,
IT STEM pipeline is diverse and representative.
right now, is your team right now, does it have anyone of color or anyone who is African American or Black on team to help unpack this data or to
On
offer
my
perspective?
specific team?
Yes.
Not at this time.
Okay. Now, is that's something, but in the future, I'm sure you'll look at that, but have you in the past as a state of Vermont done that, on big projects or issues like this?
Well, I joined in January and we have been remote for about 5 months now. So
Right. Okay.
I don't really feel like I have the depth to answer that specifically.
Okay, no, thank you on that. Pat, if you want to offer any insights on it, because you IT consultant, Racial Justice Alliance, and I needed to ask, and I thought about that, as far as the inclusion piece and who's working on these projects, who's also developing the data collection technology.
Yeah, it's an issue, and it's not something I'm really qualified to talk about, but I think it would lead you very quickly to the support for people of color going through the university system, and support for them going in the workplace, so in the private sector as well. So I know there's plenty could be done, and I've been in companies where I had initiatives to promote the hiring of people of color and Black people in the past, and they've had mixed success, so depending on the culture. But that's about all I can say about it.
Got it. We had John Sullivan, who is watching us right now. He asked the question, Eitan, I wanted to throw this question at you too, and get your perspective on it. But John Sullivan saying, are you only searching for help locally? Do you require being here in Vermont? An increased pool of remote IT workers across the country at the least should be possible to increase your chances of diversity. Eitan, jump in on that discussion. I do want to look at other aspects of this issue while we have about 5 or 10 more minutes, but Eitan, feel free to jump in.
I'm personally not looking because it's not part of my mandate. I have not, it's not my job. Do I think it's important? Yes.
Right.
I really am glad to think this through because it is something to take back to the RDAP as something that we need to work on, that we definitely need to bring before the legislature. Have we done that to now? No. Sadly, we can't do everything at once in 2 hours a month. We're doing as much as we can, but this is certainly something to go for. It's critical because as Susanna talked about, those algorithms are just, they're terrible, absolutely horrible in what they do. And they're assumed to be, value free, as though that exists anywhere.
Professor, thank you for that, Eitan. Professor Seguino, talk a little bit about what that collaborative framework looks like to you, because this is a very intriguing topic. It's very important to Vermont. And I know that there's some people across the nation who are watching this right now. I get a feeling we're going to need to do a part 2. But what does that collaborative framework look like to you inside a state like Vermont? Multi-agency, multi-institutional. We didn't even get on or even talk about what, other players or stakeholders like the business community in Vermont could be doing. But what does that look like to you when you see a state? Because it seems like that's what's needed here with this issue in Vermont is, just figuring out what the degree of collaboration looks like so we can achieve optimal transparency, optimal data sharing and information sharing, and then optimal collaboration so we get the better positive outcomes. Professor?
Well, just a couple of things. First of all, I think it's important to understand that Vermont is very new to the data game. This is true in school districts, let alone criminal justice system in Vermont. And so we are inching towards something that you're describing, which is this collaborative effort. And really, it has only recently begun to be taken seriously that there are significant racial disparities in Vermont that warrant monitoring in housing. For example, there's no data on bank lending and discrimination in bank lending. So in employment, so for example,
Yes.
job audit studies are sort of the best practice today, and we don't have those in Vermont yet. So I think that getting everybody on the same page that this is a goal that we should all be committed to is the first step. And, you know, I think we're inching towards that, and we've learned a lot from the initial legislation that required law enforcement to collect traffic stop data. And in the recent legislation, there are some rounds of improvement. But if I might comment generally on this issue of data collection and usage, you know, the criminal justice system is much broader. We've talked more about traffic stop data, but I think there are things to learn from this. I've been working on traffic data analysis in Chittenden County since roughly 2010. So that's, you know, we have something like 12 years of data. The data do not show much improvement at all, if any. And in fact, the quality of the data in places like Burlington is actually deteriorating over time, meaning that they're not paying attention to collecting race of the driver. And so, you know, it is fundamentally important for the community and legislators to have these data, but ultimately, it is the agencies that should be using this data to reflect on their own practices. How do you incentivize them to do that? I think that's a question for legislators. It is certainly a leadership issue. If the data is not complete, if there are wide disparities, as there are in several agencies in Vermont, and leadership, i.e. city mayors and police chiefs are not doing something about it, there really needs to be a way to say we need people in those jobs that are going to pay attention and use this data. So I would say this happens even if we get better prosecutorial data. How are we then going to ensure that that data is actually used to reduce the disparities that exist? So I think there's a lot to learn from this. And I just want to respond to Kaya Morris's comment about the deification of data. I think what I have found that is so fundamentally important is to combine people's stories with the data. The human cost of these disparities is huge. I get calls from people who have had experiences with the police and they are devastated by them. And I'll just tell you one briefly because it might seem so modest to some of us, but this is a graduate student at UVM who was driving in Burlington, noticed a cop car on the corner. The cop car followed her in and out, weaved in and out streets. She pulled up in front of her house. He pulls up behind her, puts the lights on, and said the reason he was stopping her was that there's a law that you have to turn on your blinker 100 feet before a stop sign. And he then proceeded to ask her, she was from, the place her from Georgia. He asked her, what was she doing in Vermont? Why was she, all of this stuff about where she was from. And she said it was only when her white roommate showed up in the window of the house that the police officer gave her back her license and let her go. She couldn't sleep for 2 weeks. Yeah. She got behind in her studies. And this is just a small incident. When you look at searches and many of the other things that happen, these issues are so serious. And for me, that's why the stories matter. The data validate the anecdotes. And so we need the data. But it is the confluence of the two that are so fundamentally important. And we have not yet in Vermont found a way to marry the two. And I'm hopeful that we could do that in the future.
So
I think go ahead, Kristen.
I do think the data is really important and helps illuminate the facts and really drives the narrative. I also think having KPIs and metrics around the quality of data is really important and making that visual, because some of the items that Stephanie had mentioned is not consistent with what I've seen in the data and the metrics and the KPIs associated with the quality of data. So I think maybe making that more visible and available would also be helpful.
Yeah. We actually have someone on Twitter who was joining in the discussion a bit, Alton Drew. It makes an interesting point here. Blacks should stop advocating for #SmartCities and surveillance gimmicks. Data collection is used to manage us. I find that very interesting because there is a whole lot of, and not just in terms of race, but just overall, there's a whole lot of concerns about the type of surveillance society that we're entering into. Anyone want to offer some thoughts on that? We've got about a few more minutes on this discussion, but we want to engage in data collection so we can get a sense of what's happening with these disparities. And tackling problems like what Professor Seguino just described, but at the same time, we have to be careful not to cross a certain line, right?
You know, data is a mirror. That's all it is, and it can be misused. That's why, you know, hopefully we move to a place where the state analyzes its data, but the independent researchers such as myself and Pat and others can analyze the data, because we don't have a stake in the game at all. And that's the safeguard of data, is that you have independent forces, community members, whoever, that can also look at the data and draw conclusions from it. But data is a mirror. I mean, you take your own, I always use this analogy because I think it's really apt. You know, you might think, you know, I'm doing pretty well, I'm not eating badly, I'm doing okay. And then you go to the doctor's office and you've gained 10 pounds.
Yeah.
That's data, and it's a reflection back on your behavior. Very similar to the data that we see around policing. And I have to say that whatever anybody says, almost every study that I have seen in the United States, and I have looked at more than hundreds of studies, people of color disproportionately are negatively impacted by the criminal justice system. So I think that even if there was a conspiracy around the data, in terms of the status quo and white supremacy, if you will, the data continues to invalidate the claim that there is no racism.
Right, right. There was one other last question here too, Alicia Barrow. When someone is pulled over, I know it's filed, but what happens if it is not actually recorded?
Could I just respond to that, Charles?
Oh, real quick.
Yeah, so one of the people that is on this call, who's a person of color, told me that in one of the agencies in Vermont that is perhaps one of the most problematic, she's been stopped numerous times during the years and was not given a piece of paper. And yet the legislation, it basically says everybody who's stopped needs to be given a piece of paper. So we know that probably in a number of agencies where it's a pretextual stop, that sometimes that a piece of paper is not given, but it should be recorded as no action taken. And that's one of the issues around data quality in Vermont. The agencies are not on the same page, and they are not complying. Some of them are not complying with the legislation.
Karen, Robin, you find that issue too, you know, as you're collecting that data, and you know that a lot of everyone's not on the same page, even though the law is very explicit about that. You know, having that paper trail established, that's just not the case all the time.
That probably is the case at some of the time. I think they're getting better at doing this. I think they are. I think e-tickets are going to bring a huge improvement to the data collection process. E-tickets are going to be done electronically by the police in their vehicles. Right now, one of the law enforcement agencies that we just did some analysis of their crashes have 8 people that enter the data. And what we learned was there was a lot of data missing and we couldn't figure it out. And he said his officers were collecting it. And what was happening is the data entry folks, who are their dispatchers and other staff in the office, were entering the data all differently. And that was a problem. So you could have, even if you had location in the data collection sets that we have right now, the files we have right now, you could get Main Street, State and Main, State Street, 125 Main. That could have been possibly the location of the stop. And so as we've been working with law enforcement agencies to collect better data, those are some of the things we've been talking with them about, is how does this need to get entered? What does it need to look like? How does it get standardized? And that's why we've worked with them to get it, to work with their vendors to get it into 2 files as opposed to 75 or so files on the site. And I don't know if that works for folks. We'll find out if that makes it easier or less easy to analyze the data, but that's what we have right now.
But it doesn't get to the core of what Stephanie was saying about if the officer's not entering the data in the first place. That's a policy thing within the individual agencies, and it's a cultural thing within the individual agencies, and is very.
Also, I think it's also a training thing, Pat. I think we're still. I think the Vermont Criminal Justice Training Council is still revising their training and getting their training out to all law enforcement agencies in the state. And I think there are going to be some points where we don't know if all police officers are entering the data for their stops, especially in the case of warnings where they give a verbal warning.
Eitan, parting thought here, because I know you got to go, and I know we have to wrap up. We actually went just a few moments over time, but go ahead, Eitan.
A parting thought on?
No, just as far as like what you've been hearing with this discussion over the past hour and a half, and you feel like it's kind of like we're touching on all the right, at least issues. I mean, I know there's a lot to do.
Absolutely, I mean, where I go back to is what Professor Seguina points out, which is, let's look at the history of this. This is all very new in Vermont. That this needs to be enriched, made more nuanced, that there need to be deeper dives, different kinds of regressions that take in different factors. Absolutely. And I'm in it. The RDAP is in it. Are we perfect? No. And there's a lot more work. And what I guess the final thing I'd say, sounding like a broken record, is for the love of God, people have got to decide that this is a priority and there needs to be money dedicated to it. It is not helpful to have bills put forth that are obviously going to require funding that have absolutely no language in them towards funding. It's simply not useful.
Definitely. It's and I think we're going to have a part 2 of this discussion at some later point. It is very important. It is very crucial. I would want to, just based on my last visit to Vermont, I would want to go back, and I would want other Black people to go to Vermont as well. So this is a problem that absolutely needs. I think the state of Vermont would want that as well. So this is something, these disparities have to get addressed urgently. So, but I really appreciate everyone's time this morning. I appreciate a little bit of your extra time too, and the wonderful insights, the candor, and the analysis. Really appreciated the work that you're all doing. Once again, our panelists have been, you just heard giving the last word, Dr. Eitan Cohen, who's visiting professor at Marlborough College, has also been working on this issue as far as racial disparities in the state of Vermont. Also, we were talking with Krista McClure, who's the Chief Data Officer for the entire state of Vermont. Thank you so much for her being here and her work. Karen Gannett, Executive Director of the Crime Research Group, I believe that's crgvt.org, if I'm not mistaken, if you want more information on them. And the Crime Research Group's Director of Research, Robin Joy, you don't see her, but she's there by phone. She was also joining us as well. Thank you both, and thank you both for your work as well. Stephanie Seguino is a Gunn Fellow and professor at the University of Vermont, a professor in economics. Thank you so much, Professor, for your time. And Pat Autilio, independent IT consultant for the Racial Justice Alliance. We also had Susanna Davis on with us. She left at 11. She is the state of Vermont's first racial equity officer. She was also joining us a little bit earlier on. I want to thank the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference, Council on Communities of Color, for making this latest installment of our Equity Gap Micro Summit series possible. Also want to thank our partners, the Vermont Legislative Social Equity Caucus. Thank the state representatives who are part of the Social Equity Caucus who were here this morning. I know you were listening in and you were providing some comments and questions as well. We didn't get to all your comments and questions, but we will be providing those in a separate space. This panel right here is being recorded, and it will be provided and housed on the CSG ERC website. So definitely look for it at csg-erc.org. Thanks again for everyone's time this morning. I'm Charles Ellison. I've been the moderator, the host, the producer for this Micro Summit Equity Gap series. I'm also executive producer, host of the daily public affairs program, Reality Check, on WURD Radio, which is based in Philadelphia. For more on me, you can go to @EllisonReport. Also go to the benote.com, the bnote.com. That's the companion magazine for this show. Thank you everyone for your time. Please have a safe and healthy weekend, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Micro Summit. Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.